Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Traces.Dreams and Future Framed TV. I am here today with a very special author. Recently we interviewed the author of Wild Leadership, and today's interviewee, Tess Lea, has written a book called Wild Policy. Tess Lea, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul. I'm so thrilled to be here this morning.
And to be fair, as I do with all my interviewees, the first question I ask is what perspectives and experiences you bring to the topic of normality?
It's such a big question, isn't it? So I'm going to claim my background as someone who was born and bred in Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia, which is already, as some very pompous person from Oxford said to me, on the margin. So Australia is the margin and Darwin being the margin to that margin. As I said at the time, depends on who's defining the centre, mate. But being on the margin also gives you a perspective on the world that is slightly different. I'll layer into that the fact that I've also had an unusual upbringing. My father was a drover and then a bush surveyor, and he shot bullocks for meat. And so I grew up knowing how to hack bullocky apart and how to sort of throw the knife into the chest of a shot bullock and throw it all the meat, axed meat, into the back of the ute and take it to our freezer. So I think that also gives me a perspective on ideas of the normal, because I realised when I left Darwin and first went to university that actually my normal was abnormal. My normal was also of a public school background where I wasn't expected to succeed. I was the kid in the class that was at the back cursing or wagging, and I was the girl you had to get past to go to the toilets. So having also had that background, going off to a toffee University of Western Australia at the time for my first year, I had another dose of how abnormal my normal was. That I had a perspective that was from the wrong side of the tracks in every single way, and I was made to know it. But it's now something that I am happy to talk about after, a full 50 years on. Happy to talk about because I think it's actually informed everything I've done in terms of my pursuits and my interests in regimes of inequality, to be honest.
You're making me very nervous about expressing any difference of opinion. You can throw a knife into a carcass. But I like how you framed that. So you're coming from the margin of the margins, and you're someone who has been very aware of their abnormality in regards to other people's normalities. And that's something that, I mean, to some degree, everyone is abnormal, but not everyone's aware of how their normal is abnormal to someone else's sense of normality. So how does someone on the margin of the margins answer the question, what is normal?
So what is normal, I'm going to deconstruct, as is the habit of anthropologists. So from an embodied point of view, from a phenomenological point of view, if you will, I think normal, I'll grab Drew Lader's definition, which is the absence of body. His thesis in a nutshell was Cartesianism makes good sense, because when we are most normal, i.e. when we're least afflicted, our body disappears and we can be all cerebral. So you're not interfered with by back pain. You don't have a stomach gripe interfering. You don't have a headache marring your capacity to concentrate. When your body is in fact being silent for you is when you are most able to be a thinking, mindful person. Your body has disappeared. So he's sort of saying normality is premised on the absence of body. And the absence of body, in my mind, related to that work, is the absence of pain. It's the absence of disability or impairment. So for me, the fight to feel normal is a fight to, have your stomach be at peace, to have your pain be at peace, for it not to be interfering or impeding your movement. So normality is a state of feeling in that sense. So I would kind of then bracket that, fight to be normal within oneself or at peace within oneself and with oneself, from then how society ascribes normality as a device of social stratification, which I think is a completely other manipulation of modes of normality than the existential one that I was describing first. In that societal one, we know the script. We know that there are norms which are ascribed, which are an attempt to control societies based on dominant narratives about how one ought to be, and that they are always in contest with how different people are trying to actually be. So your difference might be an expression of sexuality, your difference might be an expression of able-bodiedness, or otherwise your difference might be a difference of skin colour, of politics, of age, so those contests are happening all the time around this struggle to define societally what is a norm. And then there's another definition of norm, to use that word, so to take normal and turn it into norm, the normative, which inside policy, and particularly in black letter policy, i.e. policy that is legislated and has got a funding allocation, the normative is an inscription. So the normative in policy law is actually an important thing. It becomes a regulation. And that's not always a negative thing. The way social scientists use the term normative is a bit sloppy. But the normative can actually be a regulation in the direction of something you want. It could be a regulation in the direction of Safe Drinking Water Act, where a normative regulation is a requirement that, inscribed in law, a requirement that it be supplied and guaranteed, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think I've just given you a complicated
Not at
definition of
all. Not
normal,
at
but
all.
it's because I need to kind of pull it apart and put it into different categories, because I think it operates differently depending on where you are.
Absolutely. If there's anything that's coming out of these interviews, it's the definition is context bound.
Yeah.
And it changes according to in what domain you ask the question. And that was actually a really beautiful way of separating three categories of normality. One was normality within the body, the existential idea that once the body is silent, then that you can be normal. And what drew me in with that definition was I entertain the idea that the definition of normality was humanly constructed, and you can pinpoint the time at which the word normal entered the lexicon as a scientific term, as a pseudoscientific term. And you can also pinpoint the time at which that term became popular in its usage. But it's a concept. It's a concept we have in our mind. And to entertain the concept, we have to have a silent body. We have to be free of affliction. We have to be free of things impeding us from entertaining this cognitive world. So I was very much drawn to that definition of normality. Then you had normal as a device of social stratification, and how normality operates in social circles. And I think that's a really interesting one to interrogate. And then the third category, which is the topic of your book, is how normality operates within regulations. And what was really intriguing about what you gave there as an answer was how normativity in the form of black letter policy and legislation and regulations can actually operate in positive ways to give us healthy drinking water, to help save habitat, the environment, to help people on the margins of society to perhaps have a bigger space to live within. Can you speak more to normativity within policy and legislation?
Thank you, and apologies also for the interruption from my colleague in life, which is Molly Moo, who has decided that her normal is keeping all of those ghosts from the door that might be trying to get in. I've never, when I open the door to find out what she's barking at, can find that ghost, but she's asserting her rights there as well. A lot of my work has been about pointing to, I guess, the abnormal in policy, the expectation that policy is rational, it's hyper-organised, and that it's linear in terms of its unfoldings, which is a kind of a stereotype of political science approach. I say stereotype because if you go into more sophisticated political science approaches, of course, they've got far more complex ways, but we like to, in anthropology, stereotype our our other, and in this case, it's the political science definition of policy as having this orthodox linear unfolding, and that it's based on evidence that is done in the main for around some kind of adjudication of what's the best way to spend a rationed resource for the benefit of the most, like, so these kind of expectations, and everything else is treated as a deviation from that, as if there is a core normal, and then there are mistakes or there are unintended consequences. There's a whole lot of terminology that frame this, center norm, deviations outside it. And I flip that to say, no, the whole thing is unruly. It's a human creation, like your exploration of normality. It's a human creation. It's an inception. It's curated. Its reputation for rationality is also curated. It's an effect of statecraft, of norming within our systems of pedagogy and expectation. And a lot of my ethnographic work has been providing a plethora of examples to show that no, on the ground and on the street and in the paddock and how it's lived and experienced and encountered and transacted and translated and brokered and it is unruly, i.e., your abnormal is the normal. What has been classified as outside of the norms is the norm. And I've tried to explain, well, why is that? And I've given it a big meta explanation, which is in relationship to the unruliness of Indigenous social policy, that there is no greater society-wide dependence on getting any of that right anyway. It's just a collateral effect of having taken everything we need, which is land, water, and extraction rights. So that's that. But to go to the point of your question, I have tried to stay with this issue because I'm not imaginative enough to think outside of a system whereby regulations is one of the regulatory and policy, some of our best tools for manipulating this thing called the state in the favour of and to the benefit of different populations in need. So in a sense, I've circled back to say, all right, critique aside, and the big discovery that it's all abnormal aside, abnormal is the norm, what then? And my current thinking is to try conceptualize what is this thing called the state if we returned it to public benefit, if we re-seized it rather than seeing it as always and ever the mortal enemy. And I think, progressive thinking or progressive academic thinking has been a bit sloppy in not thinking through either if there's a problem with the state and you think it's going to be rectified by doing something really simple called, I want better policy on X, that's radically naive. You're leaving the entire power structure and the reasons why it serves the powerful completely uninterrupted. But if you take the opposite point of view and say the whole thing's untrustworthy and it should be dumped without filling in, well, what have you got? Because we are massively overpopulated, we are living in dense social circumstances amongst strangers where we have an overproduction of our own waste matter, and we are not self-sufficient. So given all of that, what are you filling in terms of how any of that's managed? And I'm assuming, and I deeply assume this, that it does need to be managed. And you can so I am trying to think through the capacities of regulation, not just what's problematic about it.
It's almost like there needs to be another part to that sentence. It does need to be managed, because if we value our lifestyles, if we value longevity, if we value health, then the overproduction of waste, dense overcrowded living spaces, ripe conditions for zoonotic disease to become a global pandemic, then we can't completely abandon the managerial structures we have in place, but we can't continue them at the same time. Can you give me an example of unruliness? Because the overproduction of waste, for example, is unruly, but I think unruliness is taking place at multiple levels of complexity in your fieldwork observations. What are some examples of unruliness that come to mind for you?
Well, a good example from the book comes out of the very terrible circumstance where Gail Woodford was brutally murdered on the APY lands by somebody who should never have been on the APY lands. He was released on parole, he's a murderer, and he murders. He murders a white nurse. And as a result of that murder, a new piece of legislation was introduced in South Australia, which is shorthanded as Gale's Law. And that piece of legislation was fought for by the Nursing Federation. And it argued that no nurse should ever be on call alone. Problem with that is no nurse ever allowed to be on call alone or in any circumstance where they are working alone has very big resource implications. But the South Australian government isn't responsible for providing those resources for Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, i.e., the lands where this murder happened has to get those extra resources for all of that extra on nursing and other health worker or health professional categories, not just nursing. They have to fight for the resources to be compliant with the state regulation. They have to fight for those resources from the Commonwealth, who is currently in the business of shaking its head about how long should they be in themselves in the business of funding what should they think be state funded services. So as a result, something very precious on the APY lands, which is locally provided aged care, residential aged care services, i.e. where what are called jilpi, that are really old people, are able to stay on place but looked after in residential care, their high care needs, has to close or is very likely to close because they don't have the funding to manage this staffing requirement. So something that was unique and actually addresses a undertold story in Australia that aged care services adequate for our own aged care people, as is, coming out more and more with every revelation of nastiness and neglect. But it is especially inappropriate for Indigenous people, and particularly remote Indigenous people who are lucky enough to get old. So that to me is an example of the sorts of things that happen partly because there was a symbolic requirement for the South Australian government to look like it was being incredibly responsive to this really nasty murder. You can raise a whole lot of questions about, well, for how long had Aboriginal health workers been made vulnerable to violence in the communities too, and that being of no concern. But I don't want to go down that track. I'm just trying to highlight how this business of being caught between the argy-bargy between a state and a Commonwealth jurisdiction and what seems incredibly logical to everybody, like a rightness, a wrong being corrected in terms of ensuring that no nurse should be ever made vulnerable by having to work on her own in isolated circumstances, which, as a sentence is inarguable. But there is no requirement to make that actually materially possible. That to me is a live epigram because we can keep on unpacking that. It does so much work because people think that legislation has to be funded. So if you hear that this law exists, you would, people just kind of are appeased immediately. Now, let's take that to a word like rehabilitation in mining. It has exactly the same effect. And yet, if you look at it, how it actually operates on the ground, I would give the word unruly. It is radically underfunded for the things that it's expected to do. And the requirement to have any acquittal on it lasts for about 2 seconds. And then the mining company can exit scene. At most, what you get in places where there are white eyes on the prize is, I'll chuck down some fertilizer and some rapid green growth for the first 6 years. People come in, snap, snap, good job done, exit. But the follow-up toxicities, et cetera, that's nobody's business. So
when we're talking about Australian mines, a really good example. I don't want to make assumptions here. Are you talking about when Australian mines have to pack up because the mine is closing and then they have to rehabilitate the land that they're on?
Yeah.
And because I've heard about some mines claiming bankruptcy just before they have to close so that they are no longer in a financial position to actually redress some of the environmental destruction to habitat that has been enacted while the mine was active. That's what you're talking about, yeah?
Yeah, that's another tactic, and a very common one. And so that's why I said at best, you might get that topsoil and fertilizer thrown down, but mostly it's just abandoned. So if you ever get a chance to have a look at a map of abandoned mines in Australia, it's pretty much the remote area of Australia. is a minefield of abandoned mines. And that's to greater and lesser degrees of toxicity. But my point was that the word rehabilitation, which has been every time a mine is authorised, there is, an environmental impact statement. So the hair cream smoothing down any bristles that might have come up in the meantime about, whoa, mine, the environmental impact assessment, and this idea that money is being set aside for rehabilitation afterwards does that work too. But when you look into how does any of this work and what are the fights to get even the pittance that's done, da 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 da, it unfurls. Now, I am interested in how that is simultaneously authorised and unruly,
Yeah.
That's
Authorized
yeah.
and unruly. I might be getting it wrong here, but when you've got legislation and regulations and policy and fiscal measures and budgets and council plans and corporate desires all interweaving and mapping on top of each other and unfolding over time, in sort of the spandrels of and the gaps and the on the seams of these interactions, ghosts appear and the system starts to get haunted. Can you talk to me about what you mean when you're talking about hauntology and a system being haunted?
So again, like my answer to the normality question, what's my perspective on it? You can take it on like a very literal basis. I have encountered many, many ghosts in institutions. They live in stairwells. In the fieldwork that I report on in Wild Policy, there was a ghost in the woman's toilet, and I was warned against going into the woman's toilet on the basis of that ghost. If you're working with Indigenous people, there will be places that they don't really want to go to because of the known ghosts that are there, and they will be in the most mundane of circumstances. But it's not just Indigenous people. So once you start to look at ghosts inside institutions, they're sitting inside, the airports in Thailand. They have to have little rituals to make sure that the ghosts don't interfere with the planes taking off and so on. So just as an anthropological level, ghosts are in supermarkets, let's put it that way. But I'm also talking about something else, which is a word for it might be inheritance. But inheritance that is so taken for granted it has disappeared, but nonetheless is conditioning because it is unaddressed and it is a legacy effect and it is interrupting and intercepting what is possible in the present. So offline, you mentioned, and it was very interesting to me that you mentioned that part of your effort is to try to have us rethink the normality of the paved road and to rethink that this was wilderness. Now, if I take that paved road example as a good example of how you might think about hauntology, the hauntology inside the paved road, we can definitely think about the human and other beings that were displaced for that road to have existed in the first place, the multiple forms of dispossession and property claim that were made over time, work that is done to have, to fast forward into the present moment, the cultural work that is done at every single level, including from parent to child. First time a child is taking steps roadside, the most urgent and immediate thing that parent does is instruct that child at the most visceral level of the primacy of the car's ownership of that road. So the message that we give to our children is that a large part of their public space is dedicated to this deadly thing called motorized vehicles. And whether we're doing that verbally, we're certainly doing it physically. We're doing it physically with that strong handhold and that jerking back from the unwary step onto the road and the terror in your voice when you do it.
Mm.
And
It's
the terror
visceral.
any parent feels.
As you're saying that, the visceral feeling you see when your toddler is running towards the edge of the street, and even though you might trust that toddler, you're in the insides. You're like, they usually stop. I hope they stop.
Yeah. Right. So
It's
this is
visceral. Yeah, you're
so
right.
if you it's visceral, but what you are doing there is obeying the ghosts. You're obeying all the deaths, but you are also obeying all of the now ghostly decisions over time that have allocated public space in this way to the point where you are the instrument of the socialization processes for making us obedient to that spatial ordering.
I am obeying and perpetuating the decisions made by people now deceased, and I'm paying tribute to their legacy in physically pulling back my toddler from crossing a road because of motorized vehicles, because of the primacy that we place on those large, moving, deadly objects.
Yes.
I get it. I get it.
Yes. So you can keep on thinking about that, about the inheritances, the deaths, the fears, the hauntings that are embodied in you. Your reaction is your own haunting, your fears coming forward and translated in that hard grip and that shriek and that perhaps smack, don't ever do that again, like, all the fears. And also, I am saying, in the deathly decision making that has now disappeared from view to the point that we don't have an origin. We don't have a point of origin, a singular author, right? So it's become spectral. We can talk to syndromes. You can do a genealogy, but there isn't a single author of that either. So it's ghostly in that sense.
So when I hear this, I hear someone would say it is completely normal to want to protect your children. That's the phrase that I hear. But also, and this is, I guess, the anthropological position, or a social science position perhaps, is yes, it's normal to want to protect your children. We can agree on that. But let's sort of bracket that for a moment and just think about, well, the way in which that rolls out is because we have constructed unsafe spaces. And they're not constructed by our generation. They were constructed generations ago with decisions about making cities built around roads. And living in Australia is really interesting in that regard because, our roads are big enough for our cars. There are cities that were built before cars that don't have the kind of wide open roads that we enjoy in Australia. But this was urban planning decisions preceding us. And by acknowledging the ghosts, by acknowledging the legacy here, we can start to question normality. And
Yes.
it's not saying don't protect your children. It's let's investigate the ghosts of our culture. And I think what I find really interesting about this is that people are very ready to point at other groups and other communities and say, oh, they're superstitious or they believe these things or et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's lots of ghosts that we have inherited in our society that we leave unquestioned, and they are superstitions. And yes, there is some concrete reality to them, but you know what? There's a concrete reality to the superstitions of people performing rituals for ghosts in airports in Thailand. There's a concrete reality to that, and there's a social work of those rituals that actually does serve some form of protection, socially, culturally, or some other form. But I'm interrupting you.
No, I'm nodding fiercely because I'm agreeing with you. Just the fact that, we don't acknowledge the rituals that we are performing doesn't mean that we aren't performing rituals. I mean, that's, as a fellow anthropologist, you wouldn't find that too contentious. But so that's what I'm meaning by that term. I was trying to come to grips with the fact that so much of the way policy presents itself is always as if it's entering a de novo state of conditions. Like, there's always this kind of open-ended possibility, and it's hyper constrained. But you also need to try and think about, well, but those constraints are also always open to question. But how do you open them to question when they're so deeply inherited and we're not even seeing them as inheritances? We're just taking them for granted as always was, always will be. And hauntology is a term, I've borrowed it not through the Derrida legacy, but through feminist decolonial scholarship and how they use the term hauntology to describe all the things that white people don't want to acknowledge about what's existing in current arrangements as well. And I find that a really useful way to rethink the orthodoxies of policy so that you don't fall into the spellbinding traps of thinking about policy in the orthodox ways and with the same optimisms about how if I just go to them with my very good appeals, my very good evidence, that it will just, the largesse of a decision will come my way, which, by the way, every single one of our research funding proposals kind of buys into this nonsense. So there's many imperatives for us to uphold these myths, but when you're an anthropologist, as you know, your job is to try yourself, if you haven't got cultural strangeness to help you with it, to trip yourself into seeing it as strange. Make the normal abnormal.
To trip yourself into cultural strangeness. I like that. I've got to admit, I mean, my limited understanding of hauntology and feminism, I've really valued what I've read in terms of understanding the hauntology in psychological research on motherhood and the hauntings of research on the mother-infant. And if we don't look at the very gendered environment in which that research took place, then we can't acknowledge some of the very gendered dynamics that have emerged from research that reinforces the gender model within that was the legacy within which that research took place. And it's a funny term for me because I'm able to engage it. It's a useful way of running thought experiments. And I just hope, and my fear is that people will not see hauntology for what it is, that it's not the study of, weird airy-fairy ghosts in star signs or something, that it is actually a very practical way of thinking about systems, cultural systems, political systems, economic systems, because it's a way of looking at legacies, inheritances, and what I would call the spandrels of the architecture of these designs that were designed before we created them.
Take me through what you mean by spandrels, because it's not a term I'm familiar with.
So thank you. I do appreciate questions myself. So a spandrel is where you have an archway in a rectangle. So if I was to draw an archway on a rectangle, or put an archway into a square space, and here we're really testing my drawing ability. If we draw an archway, that's my attempt at an archway, we end up with these corners over here.
Yep.
And those are called spandrels. And I like this architectural term of spandrels because it's sort of this dead space. It's we can ornament it, we can put things in there. And if you look at cathedrals, what did they put in these spandrels? A lot of the times they put goblins and saints and demons and to ward off the evil spirits from entering into the cathedral or the church. But it's a space that is non-functional.
Is that true? Because, my not necessarily completely technically deep sense of earlier architecture before they came up with ways to get load-bearing structures that weren't weight-bearing. The spandrel was, in fact, the means by which you could distribute weight and energy such that the structure then was held up.
The archway is certainly weight-bearing, but I don't think if the archway was constructed maybe it was on bridges, it certainly could be, yeah. But,
yeah, we need to look that up. Because it enabled the cathedrals to then go higher to when they solved that problem of how to distribute weight and energy.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Anyway, I'll look it up and I'll come back to you.
But the point being, it's not the archway and it's not the square space. It's the space between the arch and the right angle. So it's that space.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah.
Because it's not a design feature. It's a byproduct of the design features. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I guess that's kind of akin to the ghosts and the legacies. It's a byproduct of these structures that has been, when people made a decision to build roads, they didn't make a decision for parents to pull their kids back from roads. They made a decision for cars to have a place to move on. But in the spandrel of that decision, or the ghosts that we have inherited, is this very visceral response to standards that we have come to become accustomed to.
Yeah, but my additional point would be that they are actually also about fear of death. So there is you can really draw a very direct connection to what is sitting inside that as a haunting. The viscerality of it is the reminder of mortality, and the deepest fear for the parent is right. So it is really touching that nerve, right? And so the reason I introduced hauntology as opposed to just thinking about legacy is that some of the things that were done to Indigenous people on Indigenous lands, stolen water, these thefts, and then are treated as if, oh, well, that was just a kind of a bit of an unfortunate sort of circumstance that had something to do with something colonialism, something past. Can you stop talking about it? When in fact, they ramify forward, they shape conditions in the everyday. They also are part of why even now, if Indigenous people are able to repossess some of their lands, what they're getting is a form of toxic sovereignty, because nothing is being returned in any kind of pristine state. So you might get, to circle back, you might get that rehabilitated mine site with its only partial rehabilitation, and you will get to live with what being now toxicity adjacent, or having your waterways already contaminated. You get to live with that. That gets to infiltrate you physically, and you're already bringing forward your psychic scars. You get that in the form of cadmium in the water, and another cause on top of multiple causes already existing for kidney failure, and so on and so forth. So you can, see this thing as these are policy decisions ramifying through time, not being respectful of linearity at all, and having these ongoing presences.
That's a very sobering way to drive home the usefulness of thinking about it in terms of hauntology, and because it's about very practical fear of death. And coming back to the child, but it's normal to want to protect your child. Like, it is a very practical concern. And I think one thing to highlight here for people not from Australia, or even Australians who aren't aware of this, some Aboriginal communities, if my understanding is correct, the mining companies rent out this land for 50 or 100 years under the premise that they might rehabilitate it. But what you're saying is happening over and over and over is the toxicity is not addressed. Rehabilitation at best is superficial, and in the hauntings of these deals and in the legislation that is perhaps inadequate or not dealing with it appropriately, or is perhaps only one vehicle of several that need to be in place for something to really happen, then you have death, you have kidney failure, you have cadmium in your water, you have all these problems which are shortening lifespans and impacting upon quality of life and health.
Absolutely. You also have diminished hunting grounds. You have, there are so many entailments. And look, Indigenous people the world over, and not just Indigenous people, are at the front lines of our extraction. And, that is simultaneously well known, but also disavowed in Australia. So while policy also is, on top of everything else, not just a critique of how we might think about policy, but it is an attempt to make us aware that we, you and I, are also complicit with that extractive regime. And again, to make another loop within the loops, to pull that back to why I'm now trying to think about, yes, I know all this. In fact, I've been part of trying to, draw it to attention, but I don't know how to configure worlds otherwise. You can change the ratios so that there are less deadly energies that we are pulling upon to recreate our systems. But can we get past intensive animal farming? Can we get past intensive agriculture as a means of feeding people on a mass basis? And we've already depleted the ocean. So, what are we doing? What are our systems for doing it? How can they be made just? And I'm impatient with some of my eco friends who are always very right on some of these issues, in wanting to honour Indigenous ways of being with the land without sort of understanding, look, Indigenous ways of being with the land are really embattled. They're under strain, and people are dealing with a whole lot of issues that are to do with these hauntologies, etc., that actually enable us to have these really well-nourished deliberative events where we think through how good it would be if we could all just, listen to Indigenous ecological knowledge and we could solve our fire problems, just as for example. Now, I'm impatient with that because it's simultaneously radically simplifying, what's going on with Indigenous people now, so classical romantic moves, but also disavowing our here and now responsibilities for living with the privileges and the affordances of that extractive economy. There is very little, except for the parsley garnish on most people's, plates, that hasn't actually been freighted in through mass distribution systems and processes, logistics, and da da da. You can pretend you're doing farm to the plate, knock yourself out with that. I just
If
don't
you
think
can
it's
afford it,
thinking
yeah.
ecologically enough about what's going on. And I use the term ecological in terms of trying to think through these distributed systems that are reproducing the thing we're in.
Yeah.
So the struggle for me then is to find ways through all of that to new normals, if you like, to new normals, and to try and prefigure, well, given all of that complexity, what do we think needs to happen?
Yeah, and there's so much in what you just said, and I hope people listen right up to the end of this interview, because I mean that gets to the crux of the matter. We can give examples of, you know, from Western Australia, South Australia, you know, the nurses fearing for their life, but then legislation only going so far to address that problem. And then, you know, extractive technologies and our complicity with that extractive technology, to have roofs over our head, to have an apartment where we can block out the rest of the world. And then the problem is, you know, the farm to plate, how do you reproduce that on economies of scale? Like, it's extremely lavish to be able to do that. You know, ethical decisions like going vegan are fraught with other kinds of ethical problems. Ethical problems of being vegetarian are also fraught with other kinds of problems. And I'm not talking about the problem of, oh, not getting enough protein. I'm talking about the problems of, you know, avocados are really great for your health, but also just eating vegetables doesn't mean that you're protecting habitat, or the system.
And I'm agreeing with that and nodding as a 35-year-old vegetarian, and I gave you an idea of why I might be that, because I actually do know where meat comes from.
Oh, and who has plunged knives
that.
into carcasses, and yes.
Yeah.
I'm a flexitarian, I've got to admit. I don't cook meat at home, but I have been shifting my diet to insects recently. So, and it's quite interesting because I don't need to plunge knives into them, thankfully. But I won't go into insects. What I want to ask you is what questions we should be asking about normality, what questions we should be asking about the system, what questions should we be asking from here. If the best we can do at this point, and taking into consideration your impatience, is to ask good questions, what questions should we be asking?
So I'm interested in how there is this thing called the new normal, and the new normal seems to code for suck it up, baby. This is how it is. You know, the new normal is one in which we should expect pandemics, or the new normal is one in which we should expect out of control fires, or the new normal is one in which we can expect democracies to be threatened, or the new normal is one in which we can expect that leaders of the biggest military empire in the world is, you know, a gender abuser. This is the new normal, blah, blah, blah. You know, the world has shifted, stop whinging about it. So if we grasped that and said, no, we actually need to be a little bit more thoughtful about what the new normal needs to be, with a very, as far as we can manage it, because a condition of existence is to be in a condition of delusion most of the time. You know, if you held all the world's problems in your mind all of the time, you would be literally abnormal. You would drive yourself completely mad. And so humans are programmed to simplify perception, and to simplify memory, to simplify experience, to simplify even what they see. How much load you get is, you know, controlled biochemically, as you would know. But if we try very hard, nonetheless, to, despite our own predisposition towards delusion, to see things as they are, then we're in a pretty grave place. We're in a grave place, shorthand Anthropocene. We're in a grave place because we're overpopulated as a species, and even the insects are on their way out, I'm afraid. They're a dying breed. And what are we going to do about that is what I would like to see be part of what we grasp when we say the new normal. So I would like the question to be, what do we need the new normal to be?
Where to from here?
Yeah.
Tess Lea, thank you so much for your time today. And before we part ways, can you hold up a copy of your book?
I can. I'd love to.
Where's the best place for us to purchase copies?
So this
Stanford University Press, right?
not at the dog home. So Wild Policy is published by Stanford University Press. If you go on to Stanford's website, you can order it direct from Stanford. You can order it also through any of your independent bookstores. If you want to support your local bookstores, do it that way. It's available as an ebook, so you should ask your libraries to at least get a copy of the ebook. And I don't want to say it, but I will. If you're really up for cash, it's cheap as chips on Kindle.
Tess Lea, thank you very much once again. That was a fascinating interview, and you brought so much to the table about how we should think about normality. A really interesting conceptual tool for investigating it with hauntology, and I think a very sober and very wise question: where to from here? What new normal look like?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to Idioms of Normality, hosted by Future Frames TV and Traces.Dreams.